So my name is Evelyn Costin. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My dad is a pastor at Memorial Tabernacle Baptist Church. Spent our entire days in church. Either we're at church cleaning or we're at church serving. I didn't really learn much about Christ or learn much about church. I just showed up because my dad was a pastor. So 2011, I found out I was diagnosed with cervical cancer. They told me that I wasn't going to be able to carry children. 6 months later, I found out I was pregnant with my first son. I went to the doctors and they said that he wasn't going to live. But I carried him as long as I could. And then when I reached 24 weeks is when he was born. So he lived for 2 weeks. When he passed away, October the 3rd, that was the only time that I was able to hold him. When Amir passed away, I didn't think that God was still with me. So I felt like God gave me something that I prayed for and then just took it away from me. When I had my daughter, Imani, I decided to change careers. So I went back to school for nursing. Found out I was pregnant with my son in January of 2018. Then 2 weeks after my son was born, we got evicted out of our apartment. We slept in the car for about 4 nights straight, but then we would go from house to house, but then we would go back to being in the car. I did it through the winter with my 2 babies. It was house to house, back to the car, house to house, back to the car. So we started sleeping in a vacant house on Cumberland Street. It was a small space, no stove, no heat, no hot water, nothing. It wasn't a week or 2 weeks. It was more like 9 months. Sometimes we would hear the rats running past the door, or they would be like right outside where we were sleeping at. I felt like I was a bad mom because I couldn't provide for my children. And I prayed and I cried and I just kept praying and just kept crying, and I just waited for an answer. But this particular night, I got quiet and I got silent, and I heard God say to me, do not lean on humans. I need you to lean on me, depend on me. And the minute I let go and I actually started trusting and believing in God is when doors started opening. When I was younger, my dad used to come out to Lancaster. He used to preach at one of the churches. It was a pretty city, so why not give Lancaster a try? I looked up shelters in Lancaster, and I came across Clear House. And Friday, I packed my bags and I left Philadelphia. Our first night there, it felt like a breath of fresh air. Us laying there and we prayed, and my babies, what they said to me was, Mom, is this home? And I said yes, because it felt like home. I came from a broken place. So when I started to trust in God and to believe in God and to lean on God, He turned my fear of being a bad parent into faith. I knew that I wanted to find a church home, and I stumbled across LCBC. The church is so big, but once you get to know people, it feels like family. And that's how I feel when I walk in here, because everybody greets me and my babies by our name. They give us hugs. Everybody's so friendly. But more importantly, when I walk in, I feel God. I do. So what I learned about Jesus is I learned if you listen closely, you can hear Him. My name is Evelyn Costin, and I am life changed by Christ.
And what remarkable courage and strength that Evelyn has demonstrated in her life. I want to love one of the things that she said. She said, I came from a broken place. It makes me so grateful to be a part of a church that is filled with people who come from broken places. I'm so inspired by the way in which God is still at work. Whenever I hear stories like Evelyn's, I'm obviously inspired by the resilience that someone like that displays, but also just how whenever God is at work, even in the midst of the most difficult seasons and circumstances that we face. And I'm just reminded that even when the circumstances of our life kind of pile up against us and punch us in the face, God is still at work. Do you remember what Evelyn said when she was at what was quite possibly the worst moment of her life after she had lost her son. She said, I didn't think that God was still with me. I didn't think that God was with me. Man, I love that because it's so honest. It's so vulnerable. I know that I've been there in my life. Maybe you can relate. I've been in seasons of my life where it didn't feel like God was anywhere around. And in fact, I think this is a fundamental tension that people of faith wrestle with. It's that tension between the assurance and the conviction and the belief that God is trustworthy, that God is good, that God is worthy of our full confidence, and yet living right next to all that confidence and belief and faith is the present circumstances of our lives that seem to say otherwise. And they turn all of a sudden those God is statements into is God questions. And we move real easily between God is trustworthy to now facing a moment of our life where we're sitting there going, is God trustworthy? God is good. To all of a sudden we're feeling like, is God good? And we started this series last week called The End. And we're looking at one particular book of the Bible that gives incredible encouragement to anyone who's ever wrestled with that tension between those two things. And if any group of people had a right to feel tension between the things that they were convinced of and believed to be true about Jesus and yet still faced doubts and discouragement and questions, it was those very first followers of Jesus. Because it didn't take very long for everything around them to start falling apart. And they realized very quickly that there could be a price to pay for following Jesus. How many of you guys are history fans, by the way? Any of you guys like history? Oh boy, well, this is gonna be painful then for 90% of you who did not raise your hand. Gosh. Because I'm about to take you back to high school world history real quick. I actually think it's important to get a little bit of context to understand what we're gonna be looking at today. To get a little bit of context, I think it's good to consider what was happening in the first century. And if you kind of go back to high school world history, take you back there for a second. For some of you, trauma just got brought up, but let's just go back there for a moment. You know, the known world at the time during the first century was ruled by the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was ruled by one person at the top who took on the title of, you know what they were called? Caesar. Yeah, very good. That was the emperor. There was a long line of emperors who succeeded one another throughout the first century. And then towards the back half of the first century, starting around in the 50s and early 60s, followers of Jesus became a focal point of persecution in the Roman Empire. At one point, actually, there's historical documents that show that one of the emperors actually dipped some of the Christians in oil, placed them on stakes, and then lit them on fire to be used as lamps along the streets of Rome. Somewhere along this time, Paul and Peter, who were leaders in the early church, were killed. Peter crucified. And church history shows and indicates he was crucified upside down. Timothy, who was a leader at the church in Ephesus, was beaten to death, was murdered. But it was all about to get much, much worse for followers of Jesus. Because by the early 90s, there was a new emperor on the scene, and his name was Domitian. And Domitian claimed that he was a god, that he was God. He demanded that all the subjects in the Roman Empire worship him as Lord and God. In fact, he changed his title to Everlasting King. I don't know what your business card says, but put that on there and see how far you get. And he ordered all of the people to go to temples built in his honor all across the empire, to take a pinch of incense, some people think it was a pinch of salt, but to take a pinch of incense or salt and to throw it on the fire while proclaiming 3 simple words: Caesar is Lord. That's all you had to do. Take a pinch of incense, throw it on the altar and say, Caesar is Lord. That's simple enough, right? That's simple enough for most of the people in the world at the time. But what do you do if you've seen the resurrected Jesus and you've placed your faith in him? What do you do when you know that there is only one everlasting king who has beaten death, and there's only one Lord, and it's not Caesar? They couldn't go along with it, and it cost them dearly. Some historians estimate that Domitian had up to 40,000 Christians brutally killed across the known world at this time. In fact, he had such a terrible, horrible reputation that even secular historians like Pliny, who was one of them, referred to him as the beast. And it was at this point, roughly around the year 96 AD, that out of the original 12 disciples that Jesus had invited to follow him over 60 years before that, there was still one of those original disciples still living, and his name was John. And John he wouldn't go along with the emperor's order. But not wanting to make John a martyr and cause a scene, they decided that they were going to be really gracious to him. So instead of killing John, they decided to exile him to a remote work camp. It was actually an island. It was about 10 miles off the coast of modern-day Turkey. It was an island called Patmos. It was where they would send prisoners. It was a rock quarry where they would be left to basically hit rocks the rest of their life until they died. And it's at this moment that we find John is suffering. John has lost his friends. All the work that John had done to build the church and tell everyone he could possibly tell about Jesus was now in jeopardy. And you know that the thought had to cross John's mind at some point, and it had to be this thought: Jesus, is this what happens to the ones you love? I serve you, I follow you, and this is where we end up? He's confused. He's discouraged. He's anxious. He's afraid. And my guess is that's not too far off from how some of you have felt before. Maybe some of you, how you feel today in this season of life that you're in right now. Confused? Confused by what's going on in our world? What's going on in Europe, between Russia and Ukraine? Political division, human trafficking, conversations about gender fluidity and sexual identity, rising drug costs, mental health crisis, increasing violence, all of these things coming at us, and we really don't know how to make sense of it all. It's confusing. Some of you, it's much more personal than that. You feel discouragement over your own personal circumstances. Sickness and illness has hit your family. A broken relationship, marriage tension, death of a loved one, infertility. And it's weighing you down. Some of you, it's anxiety about the future, inflation, job security, pandemics. Some of you, it's fear of being, for some of you, for the very first time, you're starting to step out and explore what it means to follow Jesus. And because of that, you're finding yourself at odds with things you used to do or things you used to believe. And you're finding yourself afraid that maybe you're gonna be canceled because of some of your views now, or maybe you're gonna be canceled because of some of your convictions now, and you don't wanna be labeled as something that you're not. And all of this has you feeling a little bit weighed down. And if you've ever felt any of those things and you still wanted to hold on to your faith in Jesus, then you get a small sense of understanding that the spot of John and those first followers were in. And there on that island prison, John records for us that he was praying one day, weighed down by all of the confusion and discouragement and fear. And as he was praying, something absolutely remarkable happened. Jesus showed up. And Jesus responded. And he responded to John by giving John a vision of a reality that John could not see at the moment. Jesus pulled back the curtain. It's like he opened up the curtain and he allowed, just for a moment, he allowed John to see what Jesus was doing in the world at that moment. See, here's what's interesting. John knew what Jesus had done in the past. John walked with Jesus. John was there when he turned water into wine. Some of you are like, that was a good day. It was a good day. He was there that day. John was with Jesus when he fed the 5,000. John was with Jesus when he healed the little girl and raised her to life. He saw all this. John knew everything that Jesus had done, but John needed now to know what Jesus was doing. Are we tracking? what he was doing in the present. You ever felt like you needed that? It's like you know all the stories of who Jesus was and what he did, but you get into a season of life where you just feel like, Jesus, I just want to know what you're doing now. And that day on Patmos, as Jesus pulled back the curtain for John so he could see the unseen realities happening right then around him, he gave him one instruction. Jesus gave him one instruction. He told him to write it all down. He said, write down everything you see that I'm about to show you about who I am and what I'm doing right now in the world. And so he did. He wrote it all down. It's what we call the book of Revelation. It's actually a letter. We call it a book, but it's actually a letter. It was a letter that then got sent from John to the churches in the first century. And there seems to be one dominant theme that Jesus wants to make clear to his followers through this letter, and it's this: things are not as they seem. There is more going on right now than you can see. And so I just want us today to see what John saw that day and what it might mean for us. And I'm gonna read a passage from Revelation 1, and I want you to listen. If you wanna read along with me on the screen, it'll be up here. But more than anything, as you listen to these words, man, let it stimulate and engage your imagination. Listen to what it says. It says, John says that when I turned to see who was speaking to me, he hears this voice, he turns around. So it's not in his head, it's not an hallucination. He's physically turning now. I saw 7 golden lampstands. And standing in the middle of the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man. And that's how he refers to Jesus. That's a title that Jesus took on for himself. He was wearing a long robe with a gold sash across his chest. Now, let's just pause here for a second. You know, a person's clothing is the first thing that we notice about people, and we can tell a lot about people simply based on how they're dressed. You've already made up your mind about me just looking at what I'm wearing today, right? So we do this all the time. You can tell a lot about a person about how they're dressed. And the first thing that John notices is how Jesus is dressed. Now think about this. I mean, here we've got a couple of pictures here. So when you see someone wearing this, you don't have to know anything about them. What do you know? Who is that? It's a doctor, right? So you're sick, you need help, right? Here's another one. You see someone wearing this, what do you know? You're about to get a ticket, right? Right, so you see that. You see someone wearing this, what do you know about them? I'm gonna let this just sit for a moment. What do you know about them? That is someone who desperately needs prayer. We love everyone here. And John says, I saw one like the Son of Man. I saw Jesus, and he was clothed in a long robe with a gold sash. This is the way that the priest would dress. He's wearing a priestly robe. The way that the priest would dress when they would lead the people in worship. You know what priest means? Priest in Latin, it just means bridge builder. A priest is one who builds a bridge between two sides of a canyon. John is being reminded here that Jesus is the one who bridges the infinite chasm between us and God. And he does so because Jesus knows both sides of the canyon. He knows the humanity. He knows the human side because he experienced humanity. He stepped into our world. Fully human, but he also knows the God side because he is fully God. And John says that he saw Jesus not only in his priestly robe, but he was standing in the middle of those lampstands. You remember that? He was standing in the middle of the lampstands. Now that's really intentional, which we're told a few verses later represent the churches of that day. Jesus is not above the lampstands looking down, representing us and the churches. He's not outside of the lampstands looking in on them, but he is right there in the middle of the churches. And out of the gate, Jesus wants John to know, and he wants us to know, I'm here. I'm here. I am present, and I am among you right now. Jesus wants us to know that he's not detached. He is not distant. He stands among us, even now. And think about Jesus and what he reveals and where he reveals himself to John. On that island prison, in exile, in the pain and suffering, Jesus says, I'm here. Your seasons of exile, guys, listen to me. Your seasons of exile, your own experiences of discouragement, your own experiences of confusion, wondering what God may be doing, Jesus reminds John at the start, I have not left you. And he hasn't left you either. I'm here with you in the exile, in the pain, with you in the confusion. And I can turn whatever situation you are in, no matter how confusing or discouraging or painful it might feel at the moment, I can turn it into a place of worship where you will discover more about who I am and who you are if you'll lean in. And then John, man, he tries his very best. It's like he tries his level best to describe the rest of his encounter with Jesus and what he's seeing. And you realize real quickly that human language and symbolism, it can't do it justice. You can almost feel John searching for a way to describe to us what he's seeing as he looks at Jesus. Look what he says next. He says, his head and his hair were white like, I don't know, it was like wool, as white as snow. His eyes, how do I describe them? They were like flames of fire. His feet were like polished bronze refined in a furnace. His voice, man, it thundered. It was like a mighty ocean wave. He held 7 stars in his right hand, and a sharp 2-edged sword came from his mouth. And his face, man, it was like, I don't know, it was like the sun in all of its brilliance. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen something or experienced something in your life that was so remarkable, so beautiful, so breathtaking that when you tried to describe it to someone else, you struggled putting it into words? That's what's happening here. You get this sense that John is trying so hard to do an impossible task. He's trying to write down as fast as he can what he's seeing as Jesus stands before him, and yet human language fails him, and he has to resort to images and word pictures, which is why you see him using the word like a lot. And all of these images are telling us something that Jesus wanted John to know, to encourage him all those years ago. But what Jesus wants us to know as well today. So let's just consider what John saw as he looked on Jesus and what Jesus is revealing about who he is today. First of all, he talks about Jesus' head. Remember, he talks about his head and his hair were white like wool. This is describing that Jesus is ageless and wise. He's ageless and wise. Jesus is ageless and wise. It's about timelessness. Don't think old. Think about the fact that Jesus, he is timeless. It's about the agelessness of Jesus. He was there in the beginning, he will be there in the end, and he is here in the middle. He has been around to see it all, so he knows a few things about life. He's seen the rise and the fall of every empire since the dawn of time. He's been around to see the rise and the fall of ideologies and governments and pandemics. Rulers have had their day, systems of thought have had their day, but he remains. And at a very personal level, what it means is there is nothing that you are going through. There's no stumbling or struggling that you're experiencing in your life. There's no pain or discouragement that Jesus hasn't seen and doesn't already know about. He's saying to John and he's saying to us, man, I know everything around you has caught you off guard and it feels brand new in the challenges that it's brought, but it hasn't caught me off guard. I've seen it all before. He's not caught by surprise by the circumstances of your life. He isn't baffled by how to best lead you forward. You can rest easy knowing that Jesus is acutely aware of all that is going on in your life and in our world. And he is wise enough to lead us through it. Jesus is reminding us that he is infinitely wise. The one who was, who is, and will always be. But John doesn't just talk about his head, he mentions his eyes and his mouth as well. And his eyes and his mouth represent how Jesus is good and holy. Think about eyes for a second. Remember, this is probably one of my favorite descriptions that John gives. He says he had eyes like flames of fire. Now, what does fire do? It does a couple things. First, fire illuminates, right? It illuminates and brings to light things that were once in the dark. You light a fire, you can see things that you couldn't have seen before. The eyes of Jesus not only look at us, his eyes of fire, they can look through us. Guys, listen, you can fake it with everyone else in your life, but you cannot fake it with the one who has eyes of fire. He sees through it all. He sees behind the facade. He sees all the junk that is ruining my life, that's ruining your life. He sees it all. And guys, the closer you draw to Jesus, the more he will illuminate areas of your life that are not leading you to wholeness. And yes, it might make you wince. When you turn on the light and you're used to the dark, you wince a little bit because you were used to being in the dark. But wouldn't you want to know? And here's the good news. Fire doesn't just illuminate, fire also purifies, doesn't it? It can cleanse, it can burn away impurities. Jesus is revealing to John that day that he's not only pure, he is purifying. He cleanses, he liberates us, he frees us, he refines us. And John also noticed his mouth. Two things he noticed about the mouth in particular. First of all, his voice came thundering like the waves of an ocean. Have you ever sat close up by the waves of the ocean as they come crashing down? Every year when we go to the beach, we'll go by the ocean. My kids, whenever they start complaining, I just get close to the waves because then I see their mouths moving, but I don't hear them anymore. Truth right there. Have you ever sat by a waterfall, wherever there's rushing water, and the closer you get to it, the louder it gets, the more the other things that you used to hear fade into the background, they're drowned out now? I don't think you need me to tell you this, guys, but we live in a world where we are bombarded with lies about who we are, about what the good life is and how to have a good life, lies about what makes us valuable, what makes us lovable. We're surrounded with voices that remind us of our past, people who curse our future. And those voices and those ideas can get lodged into our thinking. And we need a louder voice to speak over us. One that can speak over and drown out the lies. And when Jesus speaks and we listen, it's like we're coming to the water's edge to hear the one who has a louder voice, who says, I bought you with a price. You want to talk about value? I bought you with a price. That is my voice. The voice of the one who says, even before the foundations of the earth were laid, I knew you and I loved you and I chose you to be mine. The voice of the one who says that there is no condemnation for anyone who has come to me. And Jesus reveals that his voice is like 1,000 crashing waves, and it can drown out the lies if we will listen. But his word is also like a sword, able to cut out and to poke and prod at the things in our lives that don't lead to life. Remember the word that John said it was like a double-edged sword coming from his mouth. And the word that John uses for sword doesn't refer to a long, narrow blade like a fencing sword. It actually refers to the word that was used to describe a dagger for up close, personal combat. In other words, when Jesus speaks, he comes right up to us. He gets real close because he knows us. He is a fearless truth teller. And Jesus is saying, my truth will liberate you, it will free you, it will lead you to life, but at times it's gonna feel like surgery because I'm gonna have to cut away the patterns and the habits in your life that do not lead to life. And Jesus is reminding us that he is infinitely good and holy. In the last description John gives us, he talks about Jesus' hands and feet. His hands and feet, which is a way of describing that Jesus is capable and strong. Because our hands or feet are what we use to accomplish things, right? He said his feet were like polished bronze refined in a service. Whenever I played football growing up, our coaches always used to scream at us, just stay on your feet, stay on your feet, stay on your feet. And if your feet aren't strong enough to keep you up, here's why. If your feet give way, you're vulnerable. And as John sees Jesus as he is now, he can only describe his feet as being like bronze, strong, capable, firm, steady, already tested and strengthened by fire. In other words, when everything else around us is shaking, he doesn't. When it feels like the world is shaking all around us, his feet are planted and strong. We can trust that even though the circumstances of our life have left us shaken, they have not shaken Jesus. He stays on his feet. You're safe with him. But John also noticed his hand. And he said that in his right hand he held the 7 stars. And we're told that those 7 stars represent the angels of the 7 churches at the time. But I also think it's a very subtle nod to the first century beliefs of the day, because in the first century mind, the 7 stars would have referred to the 7 planets that were known at the time. And people believed that all of life was under the sway and control of those planets. This is why the Roman emperors actually surrounded their thrones with the images of stars and planets. And Jesus presents himself with the 7 stars in his hands because he is the one who holds the stars. The planets don't control anyone. Jesus controls them. The universe is held together by his strong hand. Your fate is not determined by the universe. Your fate in life is not determined by karma. Jesus holds complete authority over the universe. And he is reminding us that he is infinitely capable and strong. John needs a revelation. And Jesus responds. And he responds to John's confusion, discouragement, and his fear by pulling back the curtain and reminding John, things are not as they seem. I'm here, and there is more going on. He's saying, John, I'm the one who stands among you right now. I'm here. He is with us wherever we are. And John, I am infinitely wise and infinitely good and infinitely strong. And then listen to how John responded to this vision. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as if I were dead. But he laid his right hand on me and he said 3 of the most beautiful words you'll ever read. Don't be afraid. I'm the first, I'm the last. I'm the living one. I died. Yep, that happened. But look, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and the grave. You know, there's 2 commands Jesus gave to John here that are so important to point out. The first one was kind of obvious. He said, don't be afraid. That's a command. Don't be afraid. The second one you may have read right over, but it's look. Don't be afraid. Look. And those 2 commands, by the way, are the most repeated commands in all of the book of Revelation, the entire letter. The first, the most repetitious command is don't be afraid. The second one is right behind it is look. And that's because those 2 go together. Because where you look will determine whether or not you're afraid. Guys, you wanna know one of the things that has discouraged me, just as a pastor, what has discouraged me most over the last couple of years? It's been the way in which fear has grabbed hold of so many followers of Jesus. So much fear has crept in, related to politics, economy, pandemic, cultural confusion. And I'm just shoot straight with you, man. It's been so disheartening at times to see followers of Jesus act on that fear by picking fights with people who don't agree with him on those issues, by using words to put down others who don't agree. And I think that what Jesus would say to us today is, when you feel fear, you've probably stopped looking at me. You've fallen into the subtle trap of believing that this is all there is, that this is all that's going on here. And it's so easy to forget the followers of Jesus. We do not place our hope. Guys, we don't place our hope in any political ideology. We don't place our hope in any cultural changes that we want to see happen or gaining our voice back in culture. That's not where we place our hope. And when Jesus wanted to encourage the very first followers of Jesus who were facing unspeakable cultural and personal challenges in their time, he didn't give them a political agenda to go and advance. It's not what he gave them. He didn't give them a cause for which to go fight for. He didn't challenge them to go and fight a culture war. You know what he gave them? A revelation of himself, and reminded them that he is still at the center and he is our hope. He pulled back the curtain and revealed that there's more going on. I'm still in charge. I've seen it all. And I have the keys to life and death. So don't be afraid. Look at me. Guys, we have nothing to fear. We have nothing to fear. And Jesus is the only one capable, truly capable of commanding us to not be afraid. I can tell you to not be afraid, but you shouldn't listen to me. I don't have the power to help. But Jesus is the only one who can command us to not be afraid. Why? Because only Jesus died, only Jesus walked into hell, and only Jesus came out victorious. And the message of Revelation, man, don't miss this. The message of Revelation is not that Jesus will win one day. The message of Revelation is that Jesus has already won. He's already won. Because he said, I hold the keys to death and the grave. And if he holds the keys to death and the grave, guys, he holds the keys to everything else. He is here right now among us. And he knows you, and he's concerned for you, and his eyes are set on you. So I want to ask you, are you anxious about anything today? Are you anxious about anything? Then look to the one who has seen it all, and he knows how to move you forward. Are you scared about anything today? Then look to the one who holds the keys of death and the grave, victorious in every way. Are you confused today? Then look to the one who is infinitely wise. Are you frustrated today by anything? Are you frustrated? Then look to the one who holds the stars in his hand and is capable and strong. Things are not as they seem, guys. There is more going on around us right now. Jesus Christ is on the throne, and he's on the way. So be courageous, and be at peace, and be ready for him to draw close to you and speak. Would you pray with me? Jesus, thank you. You are the only one who is infinitely wise, infinitely good and holy, infinitely strong and capable. We need a fresh revelation of who you are, Jesus, because it is so easy for us to look around at this life to see where we are right now, whether it's the personal circumstances of our life or the things that are happening in the world. It's so easy to forget that this is not all there is. We need a fresh inbreaking of your presence. We need a revelation of who you are and what you are doing, not what you've done, but what you are doing now. So Jesus, would you encourage us today in our discouragement, in our fear, in our anxiety, in our confusion? Would you cut through it all and remind us that you are here among us. You stand in the middle of the lampstands to bridge the gap. You are holy, you are worthy, and there is no one who's more deserving, no one who deserves our trust and our allegiance more than you, Jesus. Because only you hold the keys to death and the grave. What a good, mighty, powerful God you are.
To praise you, to bring the sacrifice you deserve. For those forgiven much, they'll not forget your touch, they'll not withhold your praise. For there is no other seated at the Father's right hand, and you're scarred with the proof of what you chose to lose, so grace was mine to gain. King Jesus, come with eyes ablaze, and on your thigh the name above names, interceding Son, our Christ the risen one, the slain and worthy Lamb. You ride to end the battle that in eternity you've already won. We praise and pull it down, the victory, the sound, heaven on earth the same. King Jesus, sing this together. Sing holy.
guys, he is so worthy of our lives because only Jesus holds the keys to death and the grave. He's already won, and he's coming again. But in the meantime, make no mistake, he is here now among us, bringing peace and forgiveness and grace to all who desire it through him. And so we have nothing to fear. We have nothing to fear. Just look at the one who is infinitely wise, and infinitely good, and infinitely strong. He's with you today. Listen, if you're here today and there's anything you would like to pray about, we'd love to have the opportunity to pray with you today. If you're in one of our rooms down in the front left, there's people in all of our rooms who would love to have that privilege to pray with you. If you're joining us online, just submit a prayer request on the LCBC app on our website, and we'd love to pray with you as well. Next week, we're going to continue working through the book of Revelation, and specifically next week, we're going to talk about heaven and the vision of heaven that Jesus gives to John. And as you're going to see next week, it may be a little different than what you have been told. You do not want to miss. Until then, LCBC, may the Lord bless and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. And may the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. See you next week.